I'll tell you a weird one,
said Jackie slowly, turning to the assembled group and carefully placing down a pint of stout so thick it looked like a spoon would stand up in it. He paused before continuing, allowing the words to hang in the air and giving the other patrons at the bar time to adjust in their seats and settle in for what was no doubt going to be a longer and more detailed story. Having allowed the statement to percolate for a moment and having not received any argument from the assembled group of listeners, he decided to continue. I was one of those listeners. A good 30 years younger than any of the others gathered in the Anchor that afternoon, I suppose that, to an outsider, I would have been seen as something of an anomaly, an odd duck in amongst a gaggle of ancient and rather jaded geese. The truth was, I came to the Anchor at the same time every day at that time precisely for this purpose. I came for the stories and because I like to listen. The one thing you can definitely say about Morton with confidence is that it's a town filled with stories. Somehow the very bricks, the trees and the fields that knit together to make up this place seem almost made out of words, whispers and rumours. The old-timers often say that Morton was built on the strength of the mills, referring to the cotton industry that kept the place alive for years. In my opinion, the place was built on myths, and there was no better place to hear those myths retold, chewed over, challenged and examined than in the Anchor Public House at around 5 p.m. every day before the later regulars turned up, but long after the local souses had begun the daily process of gently pickling themselves. I'd been teaching history at the high school in Morton for just over a year the first time I popped in for an after-work drink. It had always been my habit after classes were done for the day to stay at my desk and catch up on my marking for an hour before I called it a day, by which time the kids had all disappeared from the town centre and I could realistically slip into the local for a pint without my students seeing me and reporting to their friends the next day that Mr. Kenlon is a drunk. That first time at the Anchor, I had walked in with the intention of having one drink, sitting at the bar itself with the novel I happened to be reading at the time before heading off home. Instead, I ended up staying the entire night and making some firm friends with the old guys who were already in position at the bar and looked so comfortably in situ there that you'd be forgiven for thinking they actually grown up through the floor of the place like trees planted a long, long time ago. What kept me at the bar and kept me coming back, however, was not just the warm welcome, however. It was the stories. Fanciful, outlandish and beautifully told. They were tales of things that had happened, that were supposed to have happened, or which were collectively remembered by the 4 friends gathered at the bar. Some, you knew, were hugely embellished. Others were remembered by only one of the group and seemed like whoppers until they were corroborated later in the evening by some other patron. "Oh yes, I remember that well," they would say. "Summer of 73, I think it was." All whilst the teller, who had for a moment had his truthfulness challenged, leaned back at the bar with a smug grin of satisfaction plastered across his face. Perhaps the best of the 4 friends when it came to weaving a tale was old Jackie, who I could only assume actually lived at the Anchor because I had never yet managed to arrive before or leave after him. According to Diane, the barmaid at the Anchor, Jackie was a well-travelled and surprisingly well-educated bloke who had seen or read pretty much everything there was to read and see. She, of course, never quite put it that way, and instead phrased it as, "He's been about a bit, has Jackie," which in Morton pretty much translated to the same thing. Turning up to the Anchor that afternoon, the day after Boxing Day and after my strange incident with Claudette at the church, I had assumed that for once it might be me who stunned the others with my strange anecdote and tale of monsters. In the end, the others did show some kind of awe at my story, but that was later, long after Jackie had already stolen the show with his strange tale. It did not occur to me until much later how the 2 stories could possibly have been related other than to reflect on just how often these kinds of creepy anecdotes seem to leak out from the mouths of residents in this odd and accursed little town.
"I'll tell you,"
Jackie went on, leaning back on his stool and propping himself against the bar.
"I had the weirdest experience last night."
I glanced at the others with a wry, knowing smile. This was either going to be a good story or a terrible joke, but whichever it was, I was up for it. As it turned out, it was far from a joke.
"So I got in last night, must have been about, 10 to 12.
There was a scoffing cough from Diane, who was standing on the other side of the bar holding the glass she seemed to be perennially cleaning with a tea towel.
What a load of bollocks. You didn't leave here last night till well gone one.
Jackie's brow grew heavy, and he shot Diane a disapproving glance, but decided to continue anyway.
All right then, Father Time. 10 to 1, 10 to 2, what does it matter? The point is I just got in the house. I'd taken my boots off and I was stumbling about trying to remember where I'd left that loaf of bread so I could have some toast before going to bed. Now you've been in my house, you know what it's like with the kitchen over here.
He waved vaguely in the left-hand direction, as if we would all be able to picture the layout, despite the fact that I had never been there.
You've got the countertop here, and then obviously behind me are the patio doors, just glass to the outside. I don't have curtains because I've got a massive fence and I don't have neighbors at the back. So I come in, I'm pottering about, and eventually I just gave up on the toast and decided to go to bed. Now here's where it gets weird. With the light on, you can't see outside. You only see your reflection, don't you? I mean, not that I'm bothered. Why would I want to look out on a dark garden? There's nought there to see but some bushes and a bit of grass. Nothing worth looking at 10 to 1 in the morning. Only, when I turned the light out, there was something worth looking at. Now you know my back garden's closed off. You can get to it through the patio and step out from the back door, but you can't get to it from the street or anything because it's fenced in. It's a wooden panel fence on 3 sides all the way up to the flagstones in front of the glass. You'll know Woody. You helped me put the fence up.
Woody nodded to confirm that the description of Jackie's garden did indeed match what he had explained.
So if someone wants to get in the garden, they've either got to come into the house and walk through, or else climb over a 7-foot fence.
Jackie directed this statement at me, presumably because I was the only one in attendance. We hadn't seen this fabled fence with my own 2 eyes.
Well, last night I turned off the light and looked around and bugger me, but there's a woman. An old woman, must have been in her 60s or more, just stood there like a bastard snowman at the end of the garden.
Wait a minute,
said Woody with a snorted chuckle.
This isn't going to be one of those stories, is it? About how you brought her in and ravished her, you old devil. Cover your ears, Diane. Jackie's getting rude.
Diane stared back at Woody with a stone face glare that was at once dismissive and communicative of the fact that she had heard far worse standing behind that bar than the tale of Jackie and his garden grandma. We all laughed at this interjection, or at least we did at first. The humour was quickly strangled out of us, however, when we saw that Jackie wasn't laughing.
It wasn't funny, lads. I know it might not sound like much, but think about it. You're standing in your kitchen in the early hours of the morning. Outside, everything's deathly quiet and there's no one else around. You look out the window into your back garden, where there's only supposed darkness, and there's a figure standing there, totally still, not moving or saying anything, just standing there at the end of the garden in the snow, watching you. I mean, I couldn't work out how she'd got there. She hadn't been through the house, and she certainly didn't look like she vaulted over the fence, but there she was. Now, obviously, I hadn't seen her when I came in because the light was on. To be able to see her, it had to be off, so I ended up standing there in the pitch black looking through the glass into the garden, and there's this woman just looking at me from the end of the lawn. I shouted to her, but she never moved a muscle. Now, I'll be honest, I'd love to say I ran out with a blanket and threw it over her, but by this point was absolutely cracking it. I pulled the glass back and she still didn't move. I shouted to her again, nothing. I started walking towards her and she did this thing where she squatted down, like dropped onto all fours, but it wasn't right.
Jackie paused here, shaking his head and avoiding eye contact. He stared at the bar in front of him as if seeing not the rows of bottles but the scene from the previous evening playing out before him.
I mean, she didn't bend down and gradually go on all fours. She sort of folded, like she'd gone all floppy and just collapsed. You know, like a puppet when you cut the strings. She ended up on her belly and then on her hands and knees like she was going to start crawling. Well, I thought sod that for a game of soldiers. I ran back into the house and shut the door. I switched on the light so I could find my phone, but obviously that meant I couldn't see her anymore. I was rummaging around for the damn thing when I heard that sort of dunk-dunk sound behind me. She was tapping on the glass, banging on the patio window. I couldn't see her, but I heard it. Now that was it for me. There was no way, not a cat's chance in hell, she could have got across that garden that fast. I flipped the light switch to see where she was, and she wasn't. I mean, she wasn't there. Not at all. Not a hide nor hair of her. The garden was empty. No woman, no knocking, nothing. Now, of course, I couldn't just leave it like that, so I went outside to check.
For the men at the bar, seeing the sheen of tears gathering at the bottom rim of Jackie's eyes, there was no joking. We had not a hint of doubt that what he was saying he believed. Diane, however, was more skeptical.
Well, I've heard it all now,
she said, clearing away Woody's drink and replacing it with another without even waiting for him to order it.
I suppose you're going to tell us you went outside and even though...
Her voice took on a mockingly spooky tone.
Even though the ground was thick with snow, there wasn't a single footprint to be seen. No trace of the ghost of Granny.
She grinned broadly, but again the smile was not returned. Instead of smiling, Jackie reached into his pocket and pulled out his mobile phone. Flipping carefully through, he opened up the phone's camera app and passed the device to Diane, who examined the image closely.
There were no footprints,
Jackie said finally.
but there were handprints in tracks and lines in the snow. Big five-finger spreads going all the way to the back of the garden, as if someone had just pressed their hands into it the way kids do in the sand on the beach. Not a single footprint, just all these impressions of hands and fingers all the way up the garden.
Woody and I looked at each other puzzled and, I'll admit, more than a little creeped out.
So what? She was doing a handstand?
Said Woody.
You didn't mention that.
Jackie shook his head.
Nope, she was standing upright, just like normal. I didn't see her walk properly and I don't remember looking at her feet, but the thing is, I'm not sure she had feet. I think where she should have had them.
She had hands.
Diane finished weakly, passing the phone to each of us in turn as Jackie slowly nodded. As I said earlier, at the time I did not connect the dots linking Jackie's story to my own strange experience up at the church. That would only come later, by which time it had all begun to make some kind of sense. Though most definitely not the good kind.